A broke single mother pretended to hug a stranger to escape her cruel mother-in-law, unaware he was the city's most reclusive billionaire, seeking a reason to live. "Pretend to hug me," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread against the biting wind. The rain hammered down on the worn asphalt of the city street, a relentless and wild percussion that mirrored the chaotic thudding in Alara's chest. Each drop that splattered against her threadbare coat felt like a tiny, cold accusation, reminding her of every single thing she had lost, of every single bill she could not pay. She clutched the thin strap of her bag, its worn leather a familiar, unsatisfying weight against her shoulder, and tried to steady the trembling in her hands. She was so tired. The exhaustion was a physical entity, a heavy blanket woven from grief and fear that threatened to smother the last embers of her quiet resolve. She had to keep going for Leo. That single thought was the only lighthouse in her storm-tossed existence. Her son, her beautiful, innocent Leo, was waiting for her in their tiny, cold apartment, his small face a beacon of pure love in a world that had grown impossibly dark. He was the reason she endured. A sleek, black car hissed past, its tires slicing through the puddles and sending a plume of grimy water splashing against the hem of her trousers. Alara winced but didn't flinch away. It was just another small indignity in a long, unbroken chain of them. The city lights blurred into a dizzying smear of neon and gold, reflecting off the wet pavement in shimmering, distorted patterns that made her feel even more disconnected from the world around her. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of other people's vibrant lives, a pale shadow slipping through a world of color and warmth she could no longer access. The polished windows of the opulent storefronts displayed lives she could only dream of. Families laughing over ornate dinners, couples wrapped in expensive cashmere, children clutching gleaming new toys. It all felt like a scene from another planet. Her world had shrunk to the four peeling walls of her apartment, the sterile silence of the hospital where she had said her final goodbye to her husband, and the hollow ache in her heart that had become a constant companion. She was alone. Just ahead, under the flickering amber hue of a street lamp, a figure stood motionless, a silhouette against the downpour. He was tall, his shoulders broad even beneath the dark, soaked coat he wore. He wasn't using an umbrella, simply letting the pounding rain plaster his dark hair to his forehead as he stared into the window of a closed bookshop with a vacant intensity. There was a stillness about him, a profound and heavy sorrow that seemed to radiate from him, creating an invisible shield against the bustling city. Alara felt a strange, unspoken kinship with his desolation. He looked as lost as she felt, a fellow ship adrift in the same unforgiving ocean of grief. She didn't know it yet, but this fleeting, rain-soaked observation was the first soft click of a door opening into a future she could not possibly imagine. Her focus, however, was immediately shattered. A voice, sharp and cruel as broken glass, cut through the noise of the rain. "There you are, Alara." Alara froze. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins, a biting cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She turned slowly, her heart pounding a desperate rhythm against her ribs. Standing there, flanked by two imposing men in dark suits, was Mrs. Delacroix, her former mother-in-law. Her face was a mask of polished disdain, her perfectly coiffed silver hair untouched by the rain beneath a large, expensive umbrella. Her eyes, cold and hard as chips of granite, raked over Alara's worn appearance with undisguised contempt. "Running a little late on your payment, aren't you?" she hissed, the words dripping with venom. "I believe we had an agreement. The money you owe me for my son's funeral expenses. Or have you forgotten already?" Alara's throat tightened. The loan had been a trap, a way for this cruel woman to maintain control, to punish Alara for what she perceived as her role in her son's death. I need more time," Alara stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Delacroix let out a short, humorless laugh. "Time is a luxury, my dear. One you can no longer afford." The two men took a step forward, their presence overwhelming and menacing. Panic, raw and seismic, splintered through Alara. Her gaze darted around, searching for an escape, for any lifeline. Her eyes landed on the tall, grieving stranger still staring into the bookshop window. He was her only chance. Without a second thought, propelled by sheer, desperate instinct, she closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides. She reached him, her hand landing on his arm. He turned, his eyes, hollow and haunted, finally focusing on her. They were the color of a stormy sea, deep and full of unspoken pain. For a split second, she faltered, seeing a reflection of her own shattered soul in his gaze. But the footsteps behind her were getting closer. "Pretend to hug me," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread against the biting wind. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, a flicker of confusion crossing his gaunt features. "Please," she begged, the single word carrying the entire unbearable weight of her desperation. She didn't wait for an answer. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the cold, damp fabric of his coat. It smelled of rain and something else, something clean and masculine and faintly of expensive cologne. For a moment his body was rigid, a statue of cold resistance. She held her breath, convinced he would push her away, leaving her to the mercy of the wolves behind her. Total silence. Then, slowly, tentatively, his arms came around her. They were strong, steady, and for a sacred, fleeting moment, she felt a warmth seep through her soaked coat, a flicker of safety in the eye of the storm. His embrace was awkward, hesitant, the gesture of a man who had forgotten the mechanics of human contact. Yet it was the most profound comfort she had felt in months. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. From over his shoulder, she saw Mrs. Delacroix and her men stop short, their expressions shifting from predatory confidence to mild confusion. "Elara?" Her mother-in-law's voice was laced with uncertainty. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, clinging to the stranger as if he were a life raft. "I'm with someone," she called out, her voice muffled by his coat but gaining a sliver of strength from his solid presence. "Please leave me alone." She felt the stranger's hand move to the small of her back, a simple, protective gesture that sent a jolt through her. Mrs. Delacroix hesitated for another long moment, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the tall man whose face was obscured from her view. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, she turned on her heel. "This isn't over," she spat, before she and her men vanished into the rain-swept darkness. They were gone. Alara's body went limp with relief, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her trembling and weak. She pulled back slowly, her hands sliding from his shoulders. "I'm so sorry," she breathed, looking up into his face. Now that she was closer, she could see the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the subtle clench in his jaw. He was handsome, but it was a beauty made brittle by sorrow. "I didn't know what else to do. They wouldn't have left me alone." He said nothing, simply watched her, his gaze intense and unervingly perceptive. It felt as though he could see right through her, past the rain-soaked clothes and the desperate lie, into the very core of her weary soul. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. You saved me." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His stillness was unnerving. I should pay you for your trouble," she said, fumbling with the clasp of her worn purse. Her fingers, numb with cold, struggled to open it. Inside, nestled next to a worn photo of her husband and Leo, was a single, crisp $20 bill. It was her grocery money for the rest of the week. It was Leo's milk, his bread, his fruit. It was everything she had left in the world. A moment of internal hesitation, a fierce, protective instinct, warred with her deep-seated need to repay this man's kindness. He hadn't asked for this. He had been minding his own desolate business, and she had dragged him into the ugliness of her life. Her inherent goodness, the part of her that her husband had always cherished, won out. She pulled the bill from her purse, the paper already feeling damp from the rain. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. "It's not much, but it's all I have. For your kindness." She held the note steady, her gesture sincere and unwavering. He looked from the money in her hand to her face, And for the first time, something shifted in his hollow eyes. A flicker of something raw and profound. It wasn't pity. It was awe. He stared at the money as if it were a foreign object, a relic from a forgotten civilization. He seemed to see not just the $20, but the sacrifice it represented. He saw the empty cupboards, the skipped meals, the quiet desperation behind the selfless offer. It was a life-altering impact, a seismic shock to a heart that had been numb for years. He slowly shook his head, his gesture firm. "No," he said, his voice a low, rough baritone, as if pulled from a place of long disuse. "Keep your money, but I have to." "No," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. A brief, almost silent exchange passed between them, an unspoken understanding of shared pain and a moment of unexpected grace. He then turned without another word and began to walk away, his tall frame quickly swallowed by the heavy fog and the deepening twilight. She was left standing alone under the flickering light, the damp $20 bill still clutched in her hand. Her heart ached with a strange mix of relief and a new, more poignant kind of loneliness. She didn't know his name. She would likely never see him again. The connection, as fleeting and fragile as a raindrop, had vanished. Alistair Beaumont walked through the city, oblivious to the pounding rain that soaked through his $1,000 coat. The biting cold of the wind was a dull sensation compared to the storm that had just been unleashed inside him. For 2 years, since the car accident had stolen his wife, Amelia, and their 5-year-old daughter, Lily, his world had been a sterile silence, a cavernous mansion filled with ghosts and the echo of laughter that would never sound again. He had built an empire of gleaming steel and polished marble, a testament to his commanding intellect, but his heart had become a hollow, desolate place. Wealth was a cold comfort, a useless tool against the unbearable weight of grief. He had been standing in front of that bookshop because it was the one Amelia had loved. Her fingerprints still ghosts on the spines of books he could never bring himself to read. He went there some nights to feel the raw edge of his pain, to remember. Then the woman Elara, her tormentor had called her, had crashed into his self-imposed exile. He had felt the raw terror trembling through her small frame as she clung to him. He had seen the quiet dignity in her eyes, even as they glistened with unshed tears. But it was the $20 bill that had shattered his world. In his life, everything was transactional. People wanted his money, his influence, his power. They approached him with fawning smiles and hidden agendas. Kindness was a currency used to purchase favor. Yet this woman, who was clearly in a state of desperate need, who was being pursued by thugs for money she didn't have, had tried to give him her last $20. For what? For a moment of his time? For an unwilling hug? It was an act of such pure, selfless grace that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a light in the profound darkness he had inhabited for so long. That worn receipt for her humanity had reawakened something in him, a part of his soul he thought had died with his family. A new purpose, sharp and undeniable, took root in the barren soil of his heart. He had to find her. He had to know who this woman was, this beacon of sincerity in a world he had come to despise. And he had to help her. He wouldn't just give her money. That was too easy, too impersonal. He would become her guardian angel, her hidden savior. He would protect her from the shadows that haunted her, just as she had, for one brief moment, protected him from his own. He reached his sleek, black car, the same one that had splashed her earlier, and slid into the back seat. His driver, a discreet man named Arthur who had been with him for years, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Home, Mr. Beaumont?" Alistair stared out at the rain-streaked city lights.
No, Arthur.
"I have a new project." His voice was different. The brittle, hollow edge was gone, replaced by a quiet, unwavering resolve. "First, I need you to find someone for me. Her name is Elara." He was coming back to life. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and small, inexplicable miracles for Elara. She arrived home that night, soaked and emotionally shattered, to find a crisp envelope slid under her door. Inside was enough cash to pay Mrs. Delacroix for the month, with no note, no explanation. She stood in her small living room, the money trembling in her hand, her mind racing. It had to be a mistake. A few days later, her landlord, a perpetually grumpy man named Mr. Henderson, knocked on her door. She braced herself for another lecture about the rent being late, but instead, he wore a look of baffled respect. "Your rent," he said, scratching his head. "It's been paid. In full." For the next 6 months, Elara could only stare at him, her mouth agape. Disbelief warred with a rising tide of hope. Then came the groceries. She opened her door one morning to find 3 large bags on her doorstep, filled with everything she and Leo needed. Fresh fruit, milk, bread, vegetables, and even a small box of Leo's favorite animal crackers. Tucked inside one of the bags was a small, plush teddy bear. Leo's delighted gasp was the most beautiful sound she had heard in weeks. A sob caught in her throat. Who was doing this? Who was this silent benefactor, this invisible force of kindness in her life? Her mind kept returning to the stranger in the rain. Could it be him? It seemed impossible. He had looked as lost and broken as she was. He hadn't seemed like a man of means, dressed in that simple, dark coat. And yet, she couldn't shake the image of his eyes, the profound shift in his expression when she had offered him her money. Had he seen more than she realized? Had he understood the depth of her struggle in that single, fleeting moment? The thought was both comforting and terrifying. She felt watched over, cared for. But the anonymity of it all left her feeling vulnerable, as if she were a character in a story whose author she did not know. The secret interventions continued. A new warm winter coat for Leo appeared in a box outside her door. A bill for the electricity she thought would be shut off was suddenly marked, paid in full. Each act of kindness was a gentle thread, weaving a blanket of security around her and her son, pushing back the biting cold of her fear. From his car parked down the street, or from the window of a discreetly rented apartment across the way, Alistair watched. He saw her confusion, her tearful relief, her cautious, blossoming hope. He learned her routine. The walk to Leo's preschool, her part-time job scrubbing floors at a downtown office building, her quiet evenings spent reading stories to her son. He saw the gentle way she brushed Leo's hair, the sincere smile she gave the elderly woman who lived next door, the unwavering dignity with which she carried herself despite her threadbare clothes. Every observation confirmed his initial instinct. She was pure, she was good, and she deserved so much more than the hand life had dealt her. This quiet observation became his new ritual, a sacred duty. Protecting her gave him a purpose his billions never could. He was healing one anonymous act of kindness at a time. Their reconnection happened on a crisp autumn afternoon, in the one place Elara allowed herself a small measure of peace: the city park. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of red and yellow leaves, painting the world in an amber hue. Leo was laughing, his small body a whirlwind of joy as he chased a cluster of pigeons near the fountain. For the first time in a long time, Elara felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest loosen. She sat on a worn wooden bench, a small, sincere smile on her face, watching her son. She was so absorbed in the moment that she didn't notice the man who sat down at the other end of the bench until he spoke. He has a beautiful laugh. The voice was that same low, rough baritone from the rainy street. Her head snapped up. It was him, the stranger. He looked different in the daylight. The haunted, gaunt look was still there, but it was softer now. He was dressed in simple, well-fitting jeans and a dark sweater, nothing to suggest immense wealth. He looked ordinary and profoundly sad. "You," she breathed, her heart giving a sudden, sharp thud. He offered a small, hesitant smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." "No, not at all," she said quickly. I never got to thank you properly." "There's no need," he said, his gaze shifting to Leo, who was now attempting to share a piece of his cracker with a particularly bold squirrel. "I'm Alistair," he said, finally looking back at her. His stormy eyes were steady, unwavering. "Elara," she replied, the name feeling strangely intimate on her lips. They sat in a comfortable, soft hush for a few moments, watching the world go by. Was it you? She finally asked, the question she had been holding in her heart for weeks. The rent? The groceries? Alistair's expression didn't change, but a subtle warmth entered his eyes. I wanted to make sure you were all right, he said simply. The confession was quiet, without fanfare, but it landed with seismic force. Tears glistened in Alara's eyes. Why? She whispered. A stranger. Why would you do all that for me? He turned to face her more fully, his expression raw and vulnerable. Because you offered me your last $20, he said, his voice cracking slightly. In a world where everyone takes, you gave. You reminded me that goodness still exists. That evening, after Leo was asleep, they sat in Alara's tiny, clean kitchen. The only light came from the small lamp on the counter, casting long shadows and creating a bubble of intimacy around the small table. She had made him tea, a simple, comforting gesture. The sterile silence of the apartment felt different with him in it. It was no longer empty, but peaceful. This was the moment for confession, for forging a bond from the shards of their shattered pasts. My husband, Daniel, Alara began, her voice soft as she stared into her steaming mug. He was a firefighter. He ran into a burning building to save a child. He saved the little girl, but he didn't make it out. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. He was a hero. He was my hero. Mrs. Delacroix, his mother. She never forgave me. She said I distracted him, that if he hadn't been worried about me and Leo, he would have been more careful. She blames me. Alistair listened, his eyes unwavering, his presence a steady anchor in her sea of grief. He didn't offer empty platitudes or cheap reassurances. He simply listened, his silence a testament to his understanding. He was truly seeing her, all of her pain and all of her strength. When she finished, he reached across the table and placed his hand gently over hers. The contact was warm, firm, and profoundly comforting. You are not to blame, he said, his voice filled with a conviction that resonated deep in her soul. Then it was his turn. I had a family, he said, his own voice growing thick with emotion. My wife, Amelia, and my daughter, Lily. She was 5. She had her mother's smile. He paused, swallowing hard. We were driving back from a weekend at the coast. A drunk driver ran a red light. I was the only one who survived. The confession hung in the air, heavy and unbearable. Alara's heart broke for him, for the hollow emptiness she had first seen in his eyes. She now understood its source. She gently squeezed his hand, her own grief making space for his. They were two broken souls, finding solace in their shared tragedy. They had both lost the loves of their lives. They had both been left behind. In that dimly lit kitchen, over lukewarm tea, a bond was forged, a tender and sacred connection built not on romance, but on a deep, mutual understanding of loss. The night ended not with a kiss, but with a moment of quiet, shared sorrow. It was more intimate than any embrace. He left her with a promise to see her again, and for the first time since Daniel's death, Alara felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost to her forever. Hope. The annual foundation gala for the city's children's hospital was a gleaming affair, held in a cavernous ballroom with ornate chandeliers and polished marble floors. Alistair was the event's primary benefactor, a fact he kept intensely private, always attending as a quiet guest rather than the guest of honor. He had invited Alara, wanting to show her a different side of the world, a world where wealth could be used for good. She was hesitant at first, but he had arranged for a beautiful, simple blue dress and a trusted sitter for Leo. She felt like an imposter among the city's elite, but Alistair's steady presence beside her was a comfort. He introduced her simply as my friend, Alara, his tone protective and warm. The evening was going surprisingly well until Alara, needing a moment of fresh air, slipped away towards a quiet balcony. As she passed the grand staircase, she was intercepted. Well, look what the cat dragged in. The voice was dripping with venom. It was Mrs. Delacroix. She stood there, dripping in diamonds, her face a mask of cruel satisfaction. She had seen Alara with Alistair and had clearly made her own vicious assumptions. The public humiliation was about to begin. "I must say, Alara, you move on quickly," Mrs. Delacroix said, her voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to turn and listen. "Scrubbing floors by day and seducing rich men by night? You have more ambition than I gave you credit for." Alara's face paled. She stood frozen, dignified but visibly overwhelmed by the sudden, brutal attack. "What do you want, Mrs. Delacroix?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I want you to know your place," the older woman hissed, stepping closer. "You are nothing, a gold-digging widow who clings to any man with a wallet. You do not belong here in a world of decent people. You are trash, and you are tainting my son's memory by being here." The words were like stones, each one a painful blow. The crowd murmured, their eyes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Alara felt the walls closing in, the air growing thick and hard to breathe. She was alone, exposed, and utterly humiliated. She was about to turn and flee when a calm, commanding voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Alistair made his dramatic entrance. He moved through the crowd with a quiet but powerful authority that made people instinctively step aside. He came to stand beside Alara, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. His face was a calm, cold mask of fury. He looked directly at Mrs. Delacroix, his stormy eyes like chips of ice. "I believe you were just leaving," he said, his tone low and dangerous. Mrs. Delacroix scoffed, emboldened by her audience. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" Her latest victim, a man in the crowd, the chairman of the hospital board, gasped. "Mrs. Delacroix," the chairman stammered. "Do you not know who this is?" Alistair held up a hand, silencing him. He had not intended for this, but she had forced his hand. It was time for the grand revelation. "My name," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden, sterile silence of the ballroom, "is Alistair Beaumont." A collective, sharp gasp went through the crowd. The name was legendary, the reclusive billionaire, the owner of half the city, the man whose donations kept this very hospital running. Mrs. Delacroix's face went white, the color draining from her cheeks as the monumental weight of her mistake crashed down upon her. She stared at him, speechless. Alistair's monologue was not loud, but every word was a dagger. "This woman, Alara, is not a gold digger. She is the kindest, most selfless person I have ever had the privilege of knowing. When she had nothing, she offered me everything she had. Her character is worth more than every dollar in this room combined." He turned his gaze to the stunned crowd. "I brought her here tonight as my guest. And you," he said, his eyes locking back onto the trembling Mrs. Delacroix, "have just insulted a guest in a building that my family built, at an event that my company is funding. You speak of decent people? You wouldn't know decency if it stood right in front of you." The power dynamic had been completely, irrevocably reversed. He then looked down at Alara, his expression softening into one of profound tenderness. "Alara," he said, his voice now clear and strong for all to hear, "I would be honored if you would allow me to take care of you and Leo, to give you the life of safety and peace you deserve, to protect you from people like this." Forever, the public offer of protection and status hung in the air. A stunning declaration. Mrs. Delacroix looked as if she had been struck. Her reputation, so carefully cultivated, was shattered. Without another word, she turned and fled, her retreat a pathetic, hurried scramble from the scene of her own social execution. Alistair had not only defended Alara, he had publicly championed her, elevating her from a victim to a woman treasured by the most powerful man in the city. Total silence. In the quiet aftermath, Alistair led Alara away from the prying eyes of the guests, guiding her to a private study off the main hall. The room was dark, save for the flickering light of a fireplace. He closed the door, shutting out the world. The adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving Alara feeling shaky and raw. He turned to her, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She could only nod, 1,000 unspoken emotions swirling within her. He had not just saved her from humiliation. He had validated her, seen her, and declared her worth to the entire world. He had taken all her burdens, all her fears, and lifted them from her shoulders with a few simple, powerful sentences. The debts to Mrs. Delacroix, the threat of eviction, the constant, grinding worry about money. They had all vanished in the wake of his revelation. He had solved everything. He took a step closer, his hands coming up to gently cup her face. His thumbs brushed away the tears that were now silently streaming down her cheeks. "Ilara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond protection or friendship. "When I met you, I was a ghost. My life was over. You, with your quiet strength, your selfless heart, you brought me back to life. You gave me a reason to feel again." The air between them crackled with an undeniable energy, a profound connection that had been building since that first rainy night. "I'm not just offering you my protection or my money," he continued, his gaze intense and full of a love that was both new and ancient. "I'm offering you my heart. What's left of it, I think. I'm falling in love with you." The declaration was simple, sincere, and utterly cathartic. For Ilara, it was the final, beautiful piece of her salvation. She had met a man in the depths of her despair, and he had met her in his. Together, they had found their way back to the light. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. A kiss that was not about passion, but about gratitude, healing, and the promise of a new beginning. It was the end of her suffering, and the start of her security and love. 1 year later, the pounding rain of the city was a distant memory, replaced by the soft hush of a gentle country breeze. Golden sunlight streamed through the large bay windows of a stately but warm country home, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The house was filled not with the sterile silence of Alistair's old mansion, but with the sounds of life, the distant, happy shrieks of a child playing outside, the soft click of a dog's nails on hardwood floors, and the quiet chuckle of a woman arranging a bouquet of fresh flowers on a large wooden table. Ilara looked up as Alistair entered the kitchen, a contented smile on his face. The hollow, haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a steady, gentle warmth. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you smiling at?" he murmured, kissing her temple. "Everything," she said, leaning back into his embrace. "Leo is outside with his new puppy, convinced he can teach it to climb the oak tree. Arthur is trying to explain to him why that's a bad idea. And you're here," he tightened his arms around her. "I'm always here," he promised. Their life was idyllic, a perfect tapestry woven from the threads of their shared past and their hopeful future. They had built a new family from the ashes of their old ones. Leo adored Alistair, who had stepped into the role of a father with a natural, tender grace. Alistair, in turn, saw in Leo a chance to experience the fatherhood that had been so cruelly stolen from him. For Ilara, the constant thrum of anxiety was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace and security. She no longer had to worry about bills or cruel words. Her only job was to love and be loved. They had healed each other. Their shared grief had not disappeared, but it had transformed. It was now a sacred space they shared, a gentle reminder of the loves they had lost and a testament to the resilience of the human heart. Their love story was a quiet one, built on shared glances, gentle touches, and the deep, unspoken understanding of two souls who had found their safe harbor in each other. They were happy, truly deeply happy. This is a story about the unseen currents that connect us all. It's a testament to the idea that a single, selfless act of kindness, offered without any expectation of reward, can create ripples that change not just one life, but two. Ilara, in her moment of desperate need, reached out not with a hand seeking to take, but with a heart willing to give, even when she had nothing. Alistair, a man who had everything and felt nothing, was saved not by his immense wealth, but by the undeniable purity of that single, humble gesture. Their journey reminds us that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in dignity, empathy, and the courage to be kind in a world that is often cruel. It is a fable of how the most broken hearts can find a way to heal, not by forgetting their scars, but by allowing them to become a bridge to someone else's pain. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the quiet power of goodness, please let us know. In a world that can often feel dark and transactional, tales of selfless love and unexpected salvation are more important than ever. They are the lighthouses that guide us back to our own humanity, reminding us that every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about, and that a small act of grace can be the one thing that saves them. We invite you to join our community of viewers who believe in the power of soul-stirring narratives. Please like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales for more inspiring stories that celebrate the enduring strength of the human heart. Your support allows us to continue creating heartwarming content that uplifts and inspires. We'll see you in the next one.